They called him the most dangerous police dog in the city. No handler wanted him. No family trusted him. In the middle of a bright winter morning, one Navy SEAL walked into that shelter, and everyone warned him to stay away. But when the dog looked up, what stared back wasn't rage. It was fear, and a silent plea for one last chance. That single decision would uncover a buried truth, a betrayal no report ever mentioned, and a bond strong enough to stop a man with a gun. If you believe in second chances, loyalty, and quiet heroes, subscribe now. This is a Navy SEAL rescue dog story you won't forget. Minneapolis, Minnesota wore winter like a crown of ice. The morning light was bright but cold, the kind that makes the world look clean while it quietly steals the feeling from your fingers. Snow drifted across the streets in thin sheets, skimming along the sidewalks like restless spirits that refused to settle. Wind threaded through downtown corridors and into the quieter industrial edges of the city, where buildings stood squared and practical, their windows pale with frost. At the far end of one such block, beyond a chain-link fence dusted white and a row of parked municipal vehicles half buried at the tires, sat the city police K-9 shelter, a boxy structure of concrete and metal that hummed with fluorescent light and the faint, constant ache of barking held back behind walls. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and damp fur, with a hard undercurrent of old fear that no cleaning could truly erase. Jake Carter arrived just after sunrise, boots crunching on salted ice as he crossed the lot. He looked like a man who belonged in weather that tried to break you. Mid-30s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a jaw cut clean and sharp, cheekbones that caught the light like stone, and a neat shadow of dark stubble that made him look perpetually a day away from a long mission. His eyes were a steady gray blue, calm in a way that didn't announce itself. The calm came from having seen chaos up close and deciding it didn't get to rule him anymore. There was an old scar near his right eyebrow, faint but visible when the light hit it, the kind of mark that didn't beg for questions but answered them anyway. He wore his Navy working uniform, digital camouflage continuous across the jacket, front placket, chest area, and pocket flaps, with no solid panels anywhere, like a second skin. Winter-appropriate layers underneath, sleeves down, collar neat, and the whole pattern unbroken as if it refused the idea of compromise. People tended to notice the uniform before they noticed the man, and Jake liked it that way. It gave strangers something simple to hold on to: order. But the truth was, Jake's order had been rebuilt from the inside out after the thing that had changed him most, an ambush overseas years ago that took a friend he'd promised to bring home. Since then, he'd carried a quiet vow. If he couldn't rewrite the past, he could at least refuse to walk past suffering in the present. The shelter doors slid open with a tired, mechanical sigh. Warm air hit Jake's face, smelling of bleach and rubber mats and something faintly metallic. The lobby was bright, almost too bright, with glossy posters about community safety and K-9 partnership programs taped to the walls like hopeful prayers. A young volunteer hurried past with a clipboard hugged tight to her chest, her cheeks pink from cold and nerves. Her name tag read Emily, and she looked to be in her early 20s, average height, slim build, pale skin freckled across the nose, light brown hair pulled into a messy bun that kept falling loose. She had kind eyes that tried to be brave, and hands that moved fast like she was always preventing something from going wrong. She gave Jake a quick nod, then glanced down the hallway and swallowed hard, the way someone swallows around words they don't want to say out loud. At the front counter stood Sarah Lawson, the shelter's day supervisor. Sarah was in her early 40s, tall and lean, with a posture that suggested she'd learned to stand steady in storms. Her skin was light olive, her face narrow with tired lines at the corners of her mouth that came from years of smiling for people while carrying heavy things inside. She wore her blonde hair in a low ponytail streaked with darker roots, practical and no-nonsense, and her eyes were a clear hazel that had seen too many animals abandoned by too many humans. She had the calm of someone who could break up a fight between two scared dogs with a voice alone, but there was a guardedness to her too, like she'd built a fence around her heart after one too many "I promise I'll come back" moments that never happened. When Sarah spoke to Jake, her tone was professional, warm at the edges, but her shoulders stayed slightly tense, as if her body remembered that any day could turn sideways. "Officer Carter," she said, offering her hand. Her grip was firm, the grip of someone who cleaned kennels herself when staff called out. "Thanks for coming in. Captain Morris said you're reviewing the canine transition files for that new community initiative." Jake nodded. "That's the plan. I'm not here to disrupt your morning." Sarah let out a small laugh that held no humor. This place disrupts its own mornings. She slid a folder across the counter. Paperwork rustled in the bright, clean quiet of the lobby. Then, from deeper inside the building, a low sound rolled down the hallway. Too soft to be called a bark, too rough to be called a growl. It wasn't loud, but it had weight, like a wounded animal clearing its throat in the dark. The young volunteer Emily flinched so hard her clipboard nearly slipped. Sarah's gaze flicked toward the back corner, and for a heartbeat her composure cracked, revealing something like dread. Jake looked up. "What's that?" Sarah hesitated. Her eyes searched his face the way people do when they're deciding whether someone can handle the truth. "It's one of ours," she said carefully, and the way she said it made the word ours sound like a burden rather than a badge. "A dog who shouldn't still be here." Jake didn't push yet. He flipped open the folder, scanned the first page, signed where needed, but his attention kept drifting, tugged by that low sound and by the silence that followed it. The shelter should have been loud. Metal doors slamming, handlers calling commands, dogs barking like thunder in a box. Instead, today felt like the building itself was holding its breath. Sarah noticed his distraction and rubbed her temple. "Look," she said, voice dropping. "I'll say it before you ask. If you hear a name back there, don't go looking for it." Jake raised an eyebrow. "A name?" Sarah's jaw tightened. "Shadow." The word hung in the air like frost. Emily, standing nearby pretending to organize papers, stopped moving entirely, her fingers frozen on the edge of a clipboard. Jake repeated it quietly. "Shadow." Sarah nodded once, like she was confirming a warning sign on a road. "He's at the end, the far corner, the kennel everyone avoids." "Why?" Jake asked, simple and steady. Sarah's eyes hardened, but not with anger, more like grief sharpened into practicality. "Because he's dangerous. Because he's ruined 3 officers in training. Because he reacts badly. Especially to uniforms. Especially to men who smell like authority." She glanced at Jake's NWU, then back to his face. "Because we've tried everything, and the only thing we learned is that fear spreads. Dogs feel it, people feel it, and Shadow, he carries it like a storm." Jake set his pen down. "Has he bitten anyone here?" Sarah exhaled slowly. "Not since he arrived, but he's lunged. He's snarled, and once—" She stopped herself, as if the rest tasted like liability. "It's in the reports." Jake kept his voice calm. "What's he doing here if he's that dangerous?" Sarah's mouth pressed into a line. "Because he used to be a police dog, a working dog. And no one knows what to do with a working dog when the system decides he's a problem. They don't like euthanizing a name that once wore a badge, so they keep him in a corner and call it mercy." There was humor somewhere in the universe, Jake thought, the kind the gods must tell each other when humans confuse storage with salvation. A broken chair is still a chair, so it gets shoved in the basement. A broken dog is still a dog, so it gets shoved into a kennel and labeled, "Do not approach." Jake stood. His movements were slow and deliberate, like he didn't want to startle the building. "Show me," he said. Sarah's eyes widened. "Officer Carter." "Jake, don't. I'm serious. Don't go looking for trouble you can't fix." Jake didn't argue. He offered a small, gentle half-smile that wasn't cocky, just stubbornly kind. "I'm not looking for trouble. I'm looking for the truth." Sarah swore under her breath, then motioned for Emily to watch the front desk. "Fine," she said, grabbing a ring of keys and a leash that looked untouched. "But you do exactly what I say. No sudden moves, no reaching, no hero stuff." Jake followed her down the hallway. Overhead lights flickered slightly, bright and cold, turning the corridor into a tunnel of winter-white glare. As they passed Kennel Rows, dogs quieted. One Labrador backed up, ears low. A Malinois pressed its body against the far wall. Even the ones that barked a moment ago seemed to swallow their voices as Jake walked by, as if something deeper than instinct told them the end of this hallway belonged to something heavy. Sarah's steps slowed. "He's there," she murmured, pointing. At the very end was a rusted kennel with bars that looked older than they should have been, as though time behaved differently in that corner. A dented metal nameplate hung crooked, the letters scratched and worn. The warning tag was newer, red and stark. Do not approach. There were additional marks on the tag, dark smudges like someone had tried to cover something. Inside, in the shadow of bright overhead lights that somehow never reached the floor properly, sat a large German shepherd. He was bigger than most, not bulky, but powerful in the shoulders and chest, built like an athlete who'd forgotten what rest felt like. His coat was rough and tangled, a mix of deep sable and black, dulled by grime that clung near the legs. A jagged scar ran along the side of his muzzle, old but unmistakable, like a lightning strike etched into flesh. His ears were upright but tense, the tips twitching at every sound. And his eyes, those were the part that made Jake stop. Deep amber, not wild, not cruel, haunted, as if the dog had been looking out from behind a locked door for a long time. "Shadow," Sarah whispered, more to herself than to him. Her voice softened despite her caution, and that softness made Jake wonder what she'd seen in the quiet hours when no one else watched. The dog didn't lift his head at first. He stared at the floor, breathing slow but uneven. Then Jake stepped one pace closer and Shadow's gaze snapped upward. The change was immediate, muscles tightening, lips lifting just enough to show teeth, a low growl rising from deep in his chest like a warning drum. But beneath the growl was something else, trembling. His front legs shook faintly. His body leaned backward as if he wanted to become smaller, to disappear into the wall. Sarah tightened her grip on the keys. "Stop," she said sharply. "Right there." Jake stopped. He lowered his hands, palms open. He didn't stare into the dog's eyes like a challenge. He looked the way you look at someone you don't want to scare. Soft focus, calm posture, patient breath. "Easy," Jake said, voice low. "I'm not here to hurt you." Shadow barked once, sharp and sudden, and lunged forward so fast the air seemed to crack. He hit the bars with a heavy thud that made the kennel rattle. Sarah flinched. Emily, who had followed at a distance despite being told not to, let out a small gasp and covered her mouth. But Jake didn't jump back. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for anything. He simply held his ground like a lighthouse in a storm that was trying to convince him the sea owned everything. Shadow slammed the bars again, harder, then froze, inches away, chest heaving, eyes wide, not with anger, but with panic. His tail was tucked tight against his body. He wasn't attacking like a predator. He was cornered like prey that had learned the only language people listened to was teeth. Sarah's voice trembled with frustration and fear. "See? This is what I meant. He's not safe." Jake's gaze stayed on the dog's face. "He's scared," he said quietly, as if naming it might loosen its grip. Shadow's head jerked slightly, ears flicking at the sound of that word. Scared. Not bad, not monster, not broken beyond repair. Scared. Jake crouched slowly, knees bending like a careful hinge, keeping his body angled slightly sideways to appear less threatening. Sarah hissed, "Jake, don't—" He paused halfway down. "I'm not going closer," he promised. "I'm just lowering." Shadow's growl deepened, but it wavered, cracking at the edges. Jake noticed the scar on Shadow's muzzle more clearly now, and the way the dog's eyes kept flicking to Jake's hands, as if hands were where pain lived. Jake settled into a kneel at a safe distance. The fluorescent lights above buzzed like insects. The rest of the shelter felt a mile away. Then, Jake saw something on the kennel's paperwork board, laminated forms clipped to a metal hook. Sarah had tried to keep him from looking, but it was right there in the bright morning light. The top line read, "Status Retired K9." Below it were notes, bullet points, and then a section that had been scrubbed with black marker so aggressively the paper beneath looked torn. Still, one phrase remained partially visible, like a ghost refusing to be fully erased. Incident. Classified. Jake's jaw tightened, not with rage, with resolve. Shadow struck the bars once more, not as an attack, but as if he was trying to knock the world into a shape that made sense again. The entire kennel shuddered. The sound echoed down the hallway, and, for a second, every dog in the building fell silent. Even the air seemed to stop moving. Jake didn't look away from Shadow. He spoke softly, almost like a vow. "I don't know what they did to you," he said, "but I can see it in your eyes, and I'm not walking past it." Shadow's lips curled, then loosened. His growl faltered into a ragged breath. He stared at Jake's face like he was trying to remember what kindness looked like and couldn't quite find the picture. Sarah swallowed, watching the frozen moment between a man in unbroken digital camouflage and a dog branded with a warning label. The bright winter light outside continued shining as if the world was innocent, but in that corner, something old and heavy shifted, like a locked door creaking open in the mind. And then Jake noticed it, outside the narrow window near the hallway's end, beyond the frost-streaked glass. A figure in a dark coat stood near the fence line, half hidden by drifting snow, watching the kennel corridor as if he knew exactly where Jake had gone. Before Jake could turn his head fully, the figure stepped back and vanished behind a parked vehicle, swallowed by the bright morning glare. Jake's pulse didn't spike the way it used to in war. It tightened, controlled, like a knot. He kept his eyes on Shadow, but his instincts lit up like flares in a snowfield. Behind the bars, Shadow's amber eyes flicked, not to Jake's hands this time, but toward the window. His ears angled. A low, different sound rose in his throat, not panic. Recognition. The shelter was still bright. The snow outside still glittered. But the air suddenly felt like the moment right before a storm decides to speak. The winter sun climbed higher over Minneapolis, turning the snow outside the shelter into a field of pale fire. Every crystal reflecting light so bright it almost hurt the eyes, yet inside the concrete corridors the cold lingered, trapped in the walls like a memory that refused to thaw. Jake Carter remained kneeling on the cement floor exactly where he had stopped, the chill seeping through his trousers and into his bones, but he didn't shift his weight or tense his shoulders. He understood something most people didn't. Stillness was not weakness, it was an invitation. He placed his bare right hand flat on the ground between himself and the kennel, palm open, fingers relaxed, not reaching, not demanding. The gesture was deliberate, almost ceremonial, like setting down a weapon before crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. Shadow's breathing rasped in the narrow space, each inhale shallow and sharp, each exhale trembling as if it might break apart. The German shepherd's body stayed coiled, muscles bunched beneath a rough, dark coat, his weight rocking subtly forward and back, like a tide torn between two moons. His amber eyes flicked from Jake's face to the open hand, then to the man's uniform, lingering on the digital camouflage pattern that covered every inch of the jacket without interruption, a visual reminder of authority, commands, and consequences. Sarah Lawson stood a few paces behind Jake, keys clenched in her fist so tightly her knuckles blanched, her tall, lean frame rigid with tension. Years in this shelter had taught her how fast a situation could turn, and the lines at the corners of her hazel eyes deepened as she watched, torn between fear and a reluctant, dangerous hope. Emily hovered near the hallway entrance, her slim shoulders hunched, freckles standing out against flushed skin, unable to look away even though everything in her posture said she wanted to run. Jake kept his gaze soft, not fixed, breathing slow and audible enough to be heard over the hum of the lights. "It's your choice," he murmured, not to Sarah, not to the room, but to the dog. The words carried no command, only permission. Shadow's growl wavered, slipping into a broken sound that didn't know what it wanted to be. He shifted his front paws, claws scraping faintly on concrete, the noise sharp in the silence. For a moment, it looked as if he would retreat fully, press himself back into the corner where shadows swallowed light. But then something in him hesitated, a fragile pause born not of courage but of exhaustion. He took a half-step forward, then stopped, head low, ears angled back, eyes wide and searching. The scar along his muzzle caught the light, a pale line against dark fur, and Jake felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the same feeling he'd had years ago when a teammate bled out in the snow and whispered apologies for dying. Shadow's paw lifted an inch from the ground, hovered, dropped back down. Sarah sucked in a breath, ready to intervene, but Jake raised his left hand slightly without looking back, a silent request for patience. Time stretched thin. Outside, a plow scraped along the street, metal against ice, but the sound seemed distant, unreal. Shadow tried again. His paw rose higher this time, trembling so violently the fur blurred, and for an instant Jake wondered if the dog would bolt or strike, if this fragile bridge would collapse under its own weight. Instead, Shadow extended his leg through the bars just far enough for the pads of his paw to brush Jake's fingers. The contact was almost imperceptible, lighter than expected, like a leaf settling after a long fall, but Jake felt it travel through him all the same. a jolt of recognition that made his throat tighten. He didn't close his hand. He did not curl his fingers around the paw. He simply let it rest there, warm against cold skin, trust balanced on the edge of withdrawal. Shadow froze, eyes locked on Jake's face, waiting for pain, for punishment, for the sudden grab that would prove he had been wrong to hope. None came. Jake whispered, "That's it," his voice steady but thick with something he hadn't planned to feel. "Good." Shadow's paw pressed down a fraction more, then withdrew slowly, carefully, as if retreat itself required courage. The dog did not growl again. He did not bark. He lowered his head and sat, still tense, still afraid, but no longer lashing out at the world. Sarah covered her mouth, the keys in her hand rattling softly. She had worked with dozens of dogs over the years, broken ones and brilliant ones, and she had never seen Shadow allow even this much. Emily's eyes filled with tears she didn't wipe away. Jake rose gradually, joints protesting the cold, and turned to Sarah. "I want the paperwork," he said quietly. Sarah blinked. "Jake, you don't even know—" "I know enough," he replied. "He doesn't need another assessment. He needs a door that opens." Sarah hesitated, then nodded, shoulders slumping as if she'd been carrying the weight of this decision for months. She led Jake back toward the front desk, every step heavy, and pulled a thick folder from a locked drawer. The name Shadow was typed neatly on the spine. Beneath it, a series of numbers and stamps. As Jake signed the preliminary adoption forms, his pen scratching loudly in the bright lobby, he felt the subtle shift that comes when a choice becomes permanent. He paused once, glancing back down the hallway. Shadow watched from his kennel, ears forward now, gaze tracking Jake's movement with wary intensity. Jake turned back to the papers and wrote a new name in the designated line, the ink dark and decisive, Ranger. It felt right, a name that suggested direction, endurance, and the quiet strength to go on when the path vanished. Sarah initialed the form with a hand that trembled just slightly. "You're changing his life," she said, voice low. Jake didn't look up. "He's changing mine too." When the final signature was complete, Sarah slid the folder aside and exhaled, a sound halfway between relief and fear. Jake gathered his things, the NWU jacket catching the light as he shrugged it back into place, and headed toward the exit to wait while procedures were finalized. As he stood by the glass doors, the winter sun poured in, illuminating the drifting snow beyond the parking lot. That was when he noticed the man outside. He stood near the edge of the lot, tall and broad beneath a dark wool coat, the collar turned up against the cold. He appeared to be in his late 40s or early 50s, with a heavy build that suggested strength worn hard over years rather than cultivated in a gym. A short, graying beard framed a face cut with deep lines, his skin weathered and pale, eyes narrow and watchful beneath the shadow of a pulled-down knit cap. He did not move when Jake looked at him. He did not pretend to check a phone or light a cigarette. He simply stared, gaze fixed on the shelter doors with an intensity that made Jake's instincts tighten like drawn wire. For a heartbeat, their eyes met through the glass, and something passed between them. Recognition without context, warning without words. Then the man turned, boots crunching on snow, and walked away toward the street, disappearing behind a line of parked vehicles, just as a gust of wind sent powder swirling across the lot. Jake stepped closer to the glass, scanning for him, but the man was gone, swallowed by brightness and white. Behind him, down the corridor, Ranger let out a low, unfamiliar sound. Not a growl, not a bark, but something alert, aware. Jake didn't know who the man was or why he'd been watching, but as he turned back toward the shelter's interior, one thing settled cold and clear in his mind. This adoption was not the end of something buried, it was the beginning of something that had been waiting to be found. Morning settled gently over the suburban edge of Minneapolis, the kind of winter morning that looked almost kind from a distance. Snow lay smooth and undisturbed across lawns and rooftops, reflecting a clean white brightness that made the world feel temporarily forgiven. The sky was pale blue and cloudless, the sun sharp and cold, casting long shadows from bare trees that stood like sentinels along the street. Jake Carter's house sat near the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, a modest single-story home with gray siding, white trim, and a short walkway already cleared of snow. It was the sort of neighborhood where people waved from driveways, where routines mattered, where nothing dramatic was supposed to happen. Jake parked the truck carefully, cut the engine, and sat still for a moment, listening. Ranger shifted in the back seat, nails clicking faintly against the rubber mat, his body stiff, ears high, amber eyes darting to every movement outside the windows. Ranger was roughly 5 years old by Jake's estimate, a full-grown German shepherd with powerful shoulders and long legs built for endurance rather than speed, his coat dark sable and black with patches still dull from shelter grime. His scarred muzzle twitched as he tested the air, reading the unfamiliar sense of quiet houses, frozen soil, and distant traffic. Jake stepped out first, boots crunching softly, still wearing his Navy working uniform from the morning's community safety training session. The continuous digital camouflage pattern unbroken across jacket and pockets, sleeves neat, posture relaxed but alert. He moved slowly to the rear door and opened it without speaking. Ranger hesitated, leaning forward, then pulling back, the threshold of the truck seeming as dangerous as any dark corner of the shelter. Jake didn't tug the leash. He didn't coax. He waited. Eventually, Ranger jumped down in one controlled motion and immediately began circling, nose low, tail tucked, muscles tight, as if the open driveway were a minefield that might detonate without warning. Jake closed the truck door gently and walked toward the house, letting Ranger follow at his own pace. Inside, the house was warm and bright, sunlight pouring through wide windows onto hardwood floors and simple furniture. Jake had prepared carefully, a soft dog bed placed near the living room wall but not boxed into a corner, stainless steel bowls set neatly in the kitchen, toys still untouched in a basket, all of it arranged to offer options without pressure. Ranger ignored everything. He moved methodically from room to room, nose skimming baseboards, eyes flicking to doorways, checking corners and shadows. His breathing stayed shallow, quickening whenever Jake shifted position. When Jake set a bowl of food down, the faint clink of metal on tile made Ranger jump sideways, claws skidding, heart hammering visibly beneath his ribs. He retreated under the dining table, pressing himself against the wall, eyes wide with the memory of consequences that no longer existed but still ruled him. Jake stayed calm, reminding himself that patience was not passive. He kept his movements predictable, spoke only when necessary, and let Ranger see him sit, stand, and walk without sudden changes. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the machine hissing softly, and waited for Ranger's breathing to slow. Outside, a neighbor's police radio crackled faintly through an open garage door across the street, the sharp burst of static slicing through the morning. Ranger bolted instantly, sliding under the kitchen table, body trembling, ears flattened so hard they nearly disappeared. Jake froze mid-step, the sound echoing through his own chest. He recognized that reaction, the way the past hijacked the present, the way certain sounds carried orders, punishment, and fear no matter how far you thought you'd run. "Easy," Jake said quietly, lowering himself to sit on the floor several feet away, back against the cabinet, making himself smaller. "You're safe here." Ranger didn't move, but his eyes never left Jake's face, watching for proof that safety wasn't a lie. Minutes passed. The sunlight crept slowly across the floor. Eventually, Ranger inched forward just enough to stretch his neck and sniff the air, curiosity battling terror. When he finally approached the food bowl and took a tentative bite, Jake felt a strange swell of relief, like a mission objective quietly achieved. Ranger ate standing up, ready to flee, but he ate. It was a small victory, and Jake treated it like one. Late morning brought a knock at the door, soft but firm. Jake stood slowly and opened it to find Tom Whitaker, the neighbor from 2 houses down. Tom was in his late 50s, tall but slightly stooped, with a lean build that suggested long years of physical work. His face was weathered, skin ruddy from cold, and a neatly trimmed gray beard framed a mouth that smiled easily but cautiously. He wore a heavy parka and a knit cap pulled low, eyes kind but observant, the eyes of a retired patrol officer who had learned to read people in half a glance. "Saw you pull in," Tom said, nodding toward the interior. "Figured I'd come say hello." His gaze flicked to Ranger, who had retreated again, muscles tight. Tom raised his hand slightly and stepped back a pace. "Beautiful dog. I'll keep my distance." "Appreciate it," Jake replied. Tom's presence was calm, respectful, and he didn't linger, offering only a brief welcome and a promise to keep the radio volume down when possible. When the door closed, Ranger slowly emerged, watching the door as if expecting it to open again. The rest of the morning passed in careful adjustments. Jake left the house briefly for errands, returning with deliberate movements so Ranger could watch him leave and come back without surprise. By noon, Ranger lay near the doorway, not relaxed but resting, eyes half-lidded, breathing more even. Jake allowed himself to sit at the table and exhale. The quiet was fragile but real. It was early afternoon when a delivery arrived from the shelter, a cardboard box placed gently on the porch, taped shut, labeled with Ranger's former name and intake number. Jake carried it inside and set it on the kitchen counter. Ranger stood immediately, body tense, eyes fixed on the box as if it might explode. Jake hesitated, then cut the tape slowly, the rip of adhesive sounding far louder than it should have. Inside were folded blankets, a worn tug toy, and at the bottom, wrapped in brown paper, something heavier. Jake unwrapped it carefully and felt his fingers close around old leather. It was a collar, thick and scuffed, the kind used for working dogs, edges cracked from use. Attached to it by a short chain was a small metal tag, rectangular and scratched, letters stamped deep enough to survive time. Jake turned it over and read the words etched into the surface. Property of unit, do not release. The air seemed to thicken. Ranger's ears snapped back and he took a step away, then another, eyes locked on the collar as if it were alive. A low, distressed sound escaped his throat, not a growl, not a bark, but something close to a whine that carried too much memory. Jake felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This wasn't standard shelter equipment. This wasn't a forgotten leash. This was ownership claimed and enforced. Jake set the collar down gently as if it might bite. He crouched, keeping his voice steady. "It's okay," he said, though he wasn't sure who he was reassuring anymore. Ranger didn't approach. He stood rigid, trembling, gaze flicking between Jake and the tag as if torn between trust and terror. Outside, a car passed slowly, tires hissing on packed snow. The neighborhood remained peaceful, bright, and unaware. Jake stared at the stamped words, questions stacking up behind his eyes, and understood that the quiet he'd worked so carefully to build was already cracking. He didn't know which unit the tag referred to, or why someone had insisted on ownership long after Ranger had been discarded. He only knew that the past had not stayed buried in the shelter. It had followed them home, wrapped in brown paper, waiting patiently to be opened. The morning arrived, dressed in deception. Minneapolis looked gentle beneath a flawless blue sky, the snow sparkling as if it had been scattered deliberately to comfort the eye. Sunlight poured across rooftops and bounced off windshields, turning the quiet suburban street into something that belonged on a postcard rather than at the edge of a reckoning. Jake Carter stood at the front window of his house, sleeves of his Navy working uniform rolled down neatly, the continuous digital camouflage pattern catching the light in muted pixels of green and gray. He wiped the glass slowly with a cloth, a habit left over from years of needing his hands busy while his mind worked through harder things. The world outside looked calm enough to trust, and that alone made him wary. Behind him, Ranger lay near the fireplace on the living room rug, his large frame stretched out but never fully relaxed. The fire cast a warm orange glow across his dark sable coat, highlighting the scar on his muzzle and the subtle rise and fall of his chest. Ranger was awake despite his stillness, ears twitching at distant sounds, amber eyes half-lidded but alert. Over the past day, he had learned the shape of this house, the rhythm of Jake's movements, the way the floors creaked in the hallway. He had not yet learned peace. Jake finished with the window and turned just as Ranger's head snapped up sharply. The dog rose in one fluid motion, muscles tight, tail low, a low rumble vibrating through his chest. His gaze locked on the back of the house toward the sliding door that opened onto the yard. Jake froze, cloth still in his hand. He had learned long ago to trust the instincts of those who survived by listening to the world closely. "What is it, boy?" he asked quietly. Ranger didn't look at him. He moved toward the back door with controlled urgency, nose low, body angled as if approaching a threat he could feel but not see. Jake followed, steps light, heart steady but attentive. Outside, the backyard lay pristine beneath the sun. Snow covered the grass in an unbroken sheet except for one place near the fence line. Jake opened the door just enough to let cold air spill in and stepped onto the porch. Ranger stopped at the threshold, not from fear this time, but from focus. The tracks were unmistakable. Boot prints, fresh, crisp-edged, pressed deep into the snow. They came from the alley behind the house, crossed the yard in a straight line, stopped near the wooden fence, then turned back the way they had come. Whoever made them hadn't wandered. They had come with intent and left just as deliberately. Jake crouched, gloved hand hovering over the prints without touching. They were too large to belong to a child, too evenly spaced to be casual. Ranger stood behind him, silent now, breathing slow but controlled, ears forward, eyes fixed on the fence. Jake followed the tracks with his gaze until something caught the light near a clump of dormant bushes by the fence. He moved closer and saw a small object tucked beneath the lowest branches, partially buried in snow. Jake reached for it carefully. It was a USB drive, wrapped in clear plastic and sealed with tape, clean and deliberate despite the cold. Not trash, not forgotten, placed. Jake straightened, scanning the yard, then the neighboring fences. Nothing moved, no curtains stirred. The street beyond the fence remained quiet, bathed in sun and ignorance. Ranger let out a soft huff, the sound of a dog confirming what he already knew. Someone had been here. Back inside, Jake set the USB on the kitchen counter, the bright room suddenly feeling less welcoming. Ranger paced once, then settled near the doorway, positioning himself where he could see both the back door and Jake. It wasn't fear-driven anymore. It was protective. Jake's jaw tightened slightly at that realization. He poured himself a glass of water, steadying his thoughts. This wasn't random. The man from the shelter parking lot, the collar and the box, now this. Pieces were arranging themselves into a shape Jake didn't like. Before touching the USB, Jake checked the doors and windows, methodical and calm. When he returned to the counter, he noticed Ranger watching him closely, head tilted slightly, as if trying to understand whether this new object would bring pain or answers. "You don't have to watch," Jake said softly. Ranger didn't move. Jake carried the USB to his small home office, a spare bedroom converted into a workspace with a desk, a laptop, and neatly stacked folders from his community training work. Sunlight streamed in through the window, bright and honest, illuminating dust motes in the air. Jake sat, turned on the laptop, and hesitated for a fraction of a second before inserting the drive. Not from fear, but from the awareness that some doors, once opened, never closed quietly again. The screen lit up. A single folder appeared. The name hit him harder than he expected. Ranger. Training footage. The capitalization was stark, official, devoid of humanity. Jake felt his pulse quicken, not with panic, but with recognition. He clicked the folder. Inside were several files, each labeled with dates and codes that meant little to him at first glance. One file sat at the top, its title shorter than the rest, stripped of numbers and euphemism. "Break him." Ranger let out a low sound from the doorway, a quiet, broken whine that made Jake's hand still on the mouse. The dog had moved closer without Jake noticing, standing just behind him, eyes fixed on the screen as if he could read the words. Jake swallowed. He didn't open the file. Not yet. He closed the laptop slowly, deliberately, as if containing something volatile. He turned to Ranger and knelt, meeting the dog's gaze at eye level. "Whatever this is," Jake said, voice firm but gentle, "we're not letting it own us." Ranger's ears flicked. He didn't retreat, but he didn't lean in either. He stood, trembling faintly, caught between trust and the memory of what trust had once cost him. There was a knock at the front door. Not loud, not aggressive, just firm enough to announce presence. Ranger stiffened instantly, body shifting between Jake and the hallway, a deep, controlled growl rumbling through him. Jake rose smoothly, heart steady, instincts awake. He moved toward the door, posture relaxed but ready. When he opened it, he found Sarah Lawson standing on the porch, sunlight outlining her tall, lean figure. She wore a heavy coat over a simple sweater, blonde hair pulled back into its familiar low ponytail, strands escaping in the breeze. Her hazel eyes searched his face with concern that hadn't been there the last time they spoke. "I didn't call," she said immediately, as if answering a question Jake hadn't asked yet. "I needed to see you." Jake stepped aside to let her in. Ranger remained in the living room, watching, muscles tense but restrained. Sarah noticed him at once and stopped, hands visible, posture open. "Hey," she said softly, voice steady, respectful. "I won't come closer." Ranger's growl subsided to a low vibration. Sarah removed her gloves, rubbing her hands together as if more cold lived inside her than the weather could explain. "Something's wrong," she said. After you left yesterday, someone came to the shelter asking questions about Shadow, about you. Her jaw tightened. A man, big, quiet. He didn't give a name, just said he was following up on a unit matter. Jake felt the pieces locked together with a dull click. Did he have a beard? He asked. Sarah nodded slowly. Short, graying, eyes like he was measuring the room. Jake glanced toward the office, toward the closed laptop. He was here this morning, Jake said. In my yard, Sarah's breath caught. Jake, what did you get yourself into? Jake didn't answer immediately. He looked at Ranger, who stood tall now, no longer shaking, eyes sharp and aware. I think, Jake said finally, someone doesn't want his past remembered. Sarah swallowed, fear and guilt crossing her face. There are things about that program, things I didn't have access to, she admitted. Files that disappeared, handlers who transferred suddenly. I told myself it wasn't my place. Her voice wavered, then steadied. I think I was wrong. Jake nodded once. We'll do this right, he said. But carefully. Sarah glanced toward the back window, sunlight still flooding the room. Sunshine doesn't mean safety, she said quietly. Jake allowed himself a thin, humorless smile. No, he replied. It just makes shadows easier to see. As Sarah prepared to leave, Ranger stepped forward unexpectedly and sat near Jake's leg, close enough to touch. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. He chose you, she said. Jake looked down at the dog, feeling the weight of that truth settle in his chest. Outside, the snow continued to glitter under the bright sky, and the neighborhood went on pretending nothing had changed. Inside the office, a file waited on a laptop, its title a promise of cruelty and truth. Jake closed the door behind Sarah, returned to the desk, and placed his hand on the computer. He opened the laptop again. The folder stared back at him. Ranger, training footage. Jake clicked on Break Him. Morning flooded Jake Carter's home office with an honesty that felt almost accusatory. The winter sun poured through the wide window, bouncing off the snow outside and washing the room in pale gold, illuminating every edge of the desk, every dust mote drifting lazily in the air. The brightness made the space feel safe, ordinary, exactly the kind of place where terrible things weren't supposed to surface. Jake sat at the desk in his Navy working uniform, the continuous digital camouflage pattern unbroken and precise, sleeves down, posture straight. He had repositioned the chair so Ranger could see him clearly from the doorway. The dog stood there, weight evenly distributed, head level, amber eyes fixed on Jake with an attention that had nothing to do with obedience and everything to do with vigilance. Jake clicked play. The video opened without ceremony. No dramatic music, no warnings. Just grainy footage from a fixed camera angle inside a concrete training bay, the kind used by police departments that valued results over reflection. The lighting was harsh and flat. A younger Ranger filled the frame, coat cleaner then, posture proud but uncertain, ears forward in the way of a dog trying very hard to do the right thing. A man's voice barked commands from off-screen, calm at first, clipped, practiced. The man stepped into view a moment later. He was broad-shouldered and thick-necked, wearing a dark uniform shirt that strained slightly at the seams. His hair was cropped short, his jaw heavy, cheeks hollowed by years of chewing on anger rather than words. The name patch on his chest caught the light for just a fraction of a second as he turned, Sergeant Mason Cole. The footage didn't show blood. It did not show anything a training manual would explicitly ban. That was what made it worse. The tone shifted subtly, insidiously. Commands came faster, the leash tightened. Cole's movements grew sharp and punitive, his presence looming. Ranger hesitated once, just once, confusion flickering across his young face. Cole reacted instantly, jerking the leash, forcing the dog back into position, repeating the command louder, closer, until Ranger's ears flattened and his body stiffened. The dog complied, but his compliance was rigid, brittle, fear wired into every muscle. Jake's jaw tightened. He recognized the pattern, pressure applied until the subject stopped thinking and started surviving. The next clip cut abruptly to a later date. Ranger looked older, leaner, eyes darker, the same bay, the same handler, the same unrelenting tone. This time, Ranger reacted to a sudden movement by Cole with a defensive snap, quick, controlled, a warning more than an attack. The frame froze for a moment as if the camera itself flinched. Cole's voice erupted, furious, triumphant. The clip ended with paperwork held up to the camera, the words, "Aggression Incident," stamped in red across the page. Jake closed his eyes briefly, feeling a familiar heat behind them. He had seen this before, in other forms, in other systems. Break the subject, provoke a response, then punish the response and call it proof. Ranger moved closer. The dog stepped into the room and pressed his head gently against Jake's knee, the contact grounding and tentative at once. His ears angled back, not in fear now, but in something like worry, as if he were checking whether this truth would change the man who had chosen him. Jake placed a steady hand on Ranger's neck, fingers sinking into thick fur. "I'm here," he said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere." Ranger stayed, leaning his weight just slightly, a silent plea wrapped in trust. Jake watched the rest of the footage, cataloging dates, noticing missing segments, recognizing the careful framing of reports. He saw how Ranger's reactions were isolated, stripped of context, turned into evidence against him. He saw how fear was documented as failure. When the final file ended, Jake sat back, sunlight still pouring across the desk, and understood something with cold clarity. This wasn't just a bad handler. This was a system that had allowed a man like Mason Cole to operate unchecked because his methods produced fast results and fewer questions. Jake knew then that reporting this wouldn't be simple. Someone had protected Cole once. Someone might try again. He saved copies of the files to an encrypted drive and closed the laptop. Ranger watched every movement, then relaxed just enough to sit beside the chair, close, but not crowding. Jake stood and paced once, boots quiet on the hardwood, mind already mapping options, internal affairs, civilian oversight, media, if it came to that. He preferred to solve things within the lines, but he had learned overseas that lines sometimes existed only to protect those who crossed them. The doorbell rang. Ranger was on his feet instantly, body between Jake and the hallway, a low growl vibrating through his chest. Jake raised a hand, not as a command, but as reassurance. "Easy," he said, and moved toward the door with measured steps. When he opened it, a man stood on the porch, framed by sunlight and snow. He was shorter than Jake, mid-40s, with a compact build and a face worn smooth by years of careful neutrality. His hair was dark with gray at the temples, combed neatly, and his eyes were brown and restless, darting briefly past Jake's shoulder before returning to his face. He wore a plain jacket and gloves too thin for the cold, as if he hadn't planned to stay long. "I'm sorry to bother you," the man said, voice low, polite to the point of fragility. "Name's Daniel Price. I used to work maintenance at the canine shelter." His smile flickered and vanished. "I heard you adopted Ranger." Jake studied him, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands hovered near his pockets without ever quite settling. "What do you want?" Jake asked calmly. Price swallowed and produced a thick envelope from inside his jacket. "I can't keep quiet anymore," he said, thrusting it forward. "People think maintenance guys don't see anything. We see everything." He met Jake's eyes then, fear naked and unguarded. "You're being watched." Jake took the envelope but didn't open it. "By who?" Price shook his head. "I don't know names. I know patterns. Unmarked cars, calls that stop when you answer, and men who smile when they shouldn't." He glanced past Jake again, where Ranger stood in the living room, posture alert but controlled, his expression softened. "That dog didn't fail," he said quietly. "They failed him." Before Jake could ask more, Price stepped back. "That's all I can say," he murmured. "I've said too much already." He turned and walked away quickly, boots crunching on snow, shoulders hunched against more than the cold. Jake watched him go, instincts humming. When he closed the door, Ranger pressed closer, head level with Jake's hip, solid and present. Jake opened the envelope at the kitchen counter. Inside were photocopies of work orders, dates circled, notes scrawled in the margins, and a single handwritten page describing late-night training sessions that never made it into official logs. It was enough to corroborate the footage, enough to make noise. Jake exhaled slowly. Reporting this would invite scrutiny and retaliation. He looked down at Ranger, whose amber eyes held steady. "We'll do this right," Jake said, "but we'll do it together." Outside, the winter sun continued to shine, bright and indifferent. Inside, the truth had finally found a path through the light, and it wasn't done flowing yet. The training field lay open and bright beneath the winter sun, a wide stretch of packed snow bordered by chain-link fencing and bare-limbed trees that cast long blue shadows across the ground. The air was cold enough to sting the lungs, clean enough to feel like a promise. Jake Carter parked near the edge of the lot and stepped out, boots crunching softly. He wore his Navy working uniform as he always did now, the continuous digital camouflage unbroken across jacket and pockets, the fabric carrying the quiet authority of habit and oath. The uniform was a reminder, not of rank, but of restraint, not of violence, but of responsibility. Ranger burst from the open door with a sudden, joyous force that startled even Jake. The German Shepherd hit the snow at a run, paws digging in, shoulders rolling powerfully beneath his dark sable coat. Sunlight caught the scar on his muzzle, turning it into a pale line against motion. For the first time since Jake had met him, Ranger didn't scan for exits or flinch at echoes. He ran forward, straight and fast, tail level, ears high, a working dog remembering what his body was built to do. Jake felt a tightness ease in his chest as he watched. This was the dog Ranger had always been before fear rewrote his instincts. Jake called him back once, softly. Ranger turned on a dime and returned at a controlled sprint, stopping a few feet away, eyes bright, breath steady. He didn't crowd Jake. He waited. Jake nodded, a small smile breaking through the seriousness he wore like armor. They worked through simple drills, focus, recall, calm movement through obstacles half buried in snow. Jake kept his commands minimal and even, never raising his voice, never touching unless invited. Ranger responded with clarity that bordered on eagerness, his confidence building with each successful repetition. A man watched from across the field, leaning against a utility shed near the fence. He was in his early 30s, average height, athletic build, with close-cropped hair and a trimmed beard that softened a serious face. His jacket bore the logo of a local training cooperative, and his eyes tracked Ranger with professional interest rather than suspicion. When Jake noticed him, the man raised a hand in greeting and approached slowly, stopping at a respectful distance. "Name's Aaron Mitchell," he said. His voice was calm, measured. "Volunteer trainer. I help run day sessions when space opens up." Aaron's posture was relaxed, but there was a deliberate gentleness in the way he moved, like someone who had learned to earn trust the hard way after losing it once. "That dog's got good lines," he added, "and a good handler." Jake nodded. "We're just getting started." Aaron smiled faintly. Looks like he remembers who he is. He didn't press for details, only offered the field when needed and stepped back, leaving Jake and Ranger alone with the snow and the sun. They finished before the cold could creep too deep into Ranger's joints. Back at the parking lot, Jake clipped the leash and opened the truck. Ranger hopped in with practiced ease and settled, alert but content. Jake circled the vehicle once, habit from years that refused to fade, then climbed into the driver's seat. The engine turned over smoothly. Everything felt right, too right. The feeling hit him as he reached for the glove compartment. It wasn't intuition so much as memory, the quiet sense that something had shifted when no one was looking. The compartment opened easily. Inside, nothing seemed disturbed at first glance. Registration papers, a folded map, a pair of gloves. Then Jake saw it. A single hollow-point bullet casing rested neatly on top of the papers, brass dulled by handling, positioned carefully so it couldn't be mistaken for accident or trash. No note, no scratches, just the casing, empty and deliberate. Jake's jaw set. Ranger stiffened behind him, a low growl vibrating through the seat as the dog caught Jake's scent change, the spike of adrenaline. Jake closed the compartment slowly, as if speed might wake something that was pretending to sleep. He exhaled, controlled, then stepped out of the truck to scan the lot. No broken glass, no forced locks. Whoever had done this hadn't rushed. They had wanted Jake to find it exactly this way. He checked the rest of the vehicle. Nothing missing, nothing damaged. The message was clear. "We can reach you." We chose not to, this time. Jake returned to the driver's seat and placed a steady hand on the wheel. Ranger leaned forward slightly, ears angled, eyes fixed on the far end of the street beyond the lot. His growl deepened, not panicked, not frantic, focused. Jake followed his gaze. At the edge of the block, partially obscured by a snowbank and parked vans, a black sedan idled. The windows were dark, the engine sound barely audible from this distance. It didn't move. It didn't leave. It waited. Jake's phone buzzed. A text from Sarah Lawson appeared on the screen. "Just heard from a friend downtown. Someone asked about your truck. Be careful." Jake didn't respond immediately. He started the engine and pulled out slowly, deliberately, giving no sign that he'd noticed the sedan. Ranger shifted, watching through the rear window. The black car remained where it was, engine cutting suddenly, as if conserving patience rather than fuel. Jake turned onto the main road, heart steady, mind racing. This wasn't a warning meant to scare him into silence. It was a test to see if he would flinch, retreat, or escalate. He drove the long way home, checking mirrors, varying speed. The sedan didn't follow. That worried him more than pursuit would have. At a red light near a grocery store, Ranger placed his paw briefly on the center console, grounding himself against motion and noise. Jake glanced at him and nodded, a silent acknowledgement between partners. At home, Jake parked in the driveway and waited a moment before getting out. The neighborhood was quiet, sun still high, snow still shining. Children's laughter drifted faintly from a few houses down. Normalcy persisted, indifferent. Jake opened the door. Ranger exited first and stood watch, body angled outward, muscles coiled but calm. Inside, Jake set the casing on the kitchen counter beside the envelope Daniel Price had delivered earlier. 2 artifacts of the same threat, different languages saying the same thing. He washed his hands, the ritual grounding him, then knelt to Ranger's level. "You did good today," he said softly. Ranger's tail thumped once, restrained, proud. A knock sounded at the door, not the bell this time. 3 firm raps. Ranger moved instantly, positioning himself between Jake and the entryway, stance wide and solid. Jake approached and opened the door to find Aaron Mitchell standing on the porch again, breath visible in the cold. Up close, Aaron's eyes were clearer, hazel, earnest, and there was a faint scar along his left forearm visible beneath his jacket cuff, the kind earned from a leash pulled wrong or a dog that learned fear before trust. "Sorry to drop by unannounced," Aaron said, keeping his hands visible. "I saw your truck earlier. Someone was near it who didn't belong." Jake's gaze sharpened. "You saw them?" Aaron nodded once. "Didn't get a plate. Black sedan, 2 men. They didn't do anything illegal I could prove. Just watched." He hesitated, then added, "I've seen that look before. It's not curiosity." Jake thanked him and watched as Aaron left, his shoulders tight as if he'd shared something costly. When the door closed, Ranger let out a low huff and settled near Jake's leg. The sun dipped slightly, shadows lengthening, but daylight still held the street in its grasp. Jake stood at the window and looked down the block. At the far end, the black sedan sat once more, engine off, unmoving. Ranger's growl rolled through the room, deep and certain. Jake felt the line between morning and night blur, danger arriving early, uninvited. He picked up the hollow casing, its weight insignificant, its meaning heavy. "Not tonight," Jake murmured, unsure whether he was speaking to the car, the men inside it, or the past that refused to stay buried. Outside, the sedan remained still, as if listening. The decision came quietly, the way real decisions often did, without drama, without ceremony, settling into Jake Carter's chest as a certainty rather than a debate. Morning light cut hard across the outskirts of Minneapolis, turning the thick snow into a blinding sheet that forced the eyes to narrow and the breath to slow. The wind moved with purpose, lifting fine crystals and flinging them sideways so they stung the face like glass dust. Jake drove beyond the neighborhoods and warehouses, past the last polite edge of the city where streetlights thinned and the land opened into forgotten service roads and fenced-off lots. Ranger rode in the back seat, alert and silent, his body angled forward as if he already knew where they were going. The German shepherd's dark coat stood out starkly against the white beyond the windows, his scarred muzzle tight, amber eyes fixed ahead, not curious, but braced. Jake followed the trail of paperwork and half-erased addresses he'd pulled from the envelope in the files, old requisitions, maintenance codes, and a training site listed as decommissioned years ago. It lay at the city's ragged border, where snowdrifts piled unchecked and the wind spoke louder than any sign. The compound emerged from the glare like a memory refusing to die. Chain-link fencing sagged under the weight of ice, rust bleeding through where paint had failed. A wide gate stood half open, hinges frozen in a posture of abandonment. Beyond it, low concrete buildings squatted against the wind, windows boarded, doors scarred by years of use and neglect. The place smelled of cold metal and old oil, even from the road. Jake parked outside the gate and stepped down, his Navy working uniform catching the sun in dull pixels, the continuous digital camouflage unbroken and familiar, a line of order cutting through a landscape that had long since given up on it. He clipped the leash, but kept it loose. Ranger jumped down and immediately froze, muscles locking beneath his fur, tail dropping low. The dog's ears flattened, then twitched, then flattened again as if the air itself were speaking in a language he wished he'd forgotten. Jake didn't rush him. He waited until Ranger took a breath that reached his ribs, until the dog's weight shifted from backward to forward. They moved together through the gate, boots and paws crunching softly. Tracks marred the snow, old vehicle ruts, scattered footprints, some fresh enough to worry Jake, others softened by drifting powder. Ranger's head dipped, nose testing the ground, then lifted again, his gaze sweeping the buildings with attention that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. This place knew him. Inside the nearest building, the light dimmed abruptly. Jake pushed the door open with his shoulder, the metal complaining with a long, hollow scrape. Dust motes spun in the beam of sunlight that followed them in, revealing a wide training bay with scuffed floors and faded markers painted on the walls. Hooks hung empty where equipment once lived. The silence pressed close. Ranger stepped inside and stopped, body rigid, breath shallow. His eyes darted to the corners, then to the center of the room, as if expecting commands to rain down from nowhere. Jake knelt briefly, placing his hand near Ranger's shoulder without touching. "You're not alone," he said quietly. Ranger didn't look at him, but his breathing steadied by a fraction. They moved deeper, into a storage room at the back where the cold pooled thick and unmoving. A single window let in a harsh stripe of light that cut across stacked crates and dented lockers. Jake brushed snow from a metal table and began opening drawers. Paperwork lay scattered, logs bound with string, clipboards with cracked plastic covers, disciplinary sheets stamped and restamped until the ink bled through. Names appeared and vanished under black marker, dates circled, signatures piled like alibis. Jake's jaw tightened as he flipped pages, cataloging patterns. Ranger paced once, then sat near the doorway, back straight, head high, guarding without being told. One ledger sat apart from the rest, its cover worn smooth by hands that had opened it often. Jake lifted it and felt the weight of intention in its spine. Inside, training notes marched in a tight, aggressive hand. Corrections logged as necessities, escalations justified as efficiency. At the back, a page had been torn free, leaving a jagged edge. Tucked into the binding, Jake found a folded list, thin paper creased again and again. Names ran down the page, some crossed out, some starred. One stood unmarked and bold by comparison, the ink darker as if pressed harder. Mason Cole. Beside it, several initials clustered like witnesses who never spoke. Jake exhaled slowly. This wasn't a single bad day or a misunderstanding. This was a method. A sound echoed down the hall, soft at first, then decisive. Ranger rose in one smooth motion, body angling toward the doorway, a low warning rumbling deep in his chest. Jake turned just as the metal door at the far end slammed shut with a concussive clang that rattled the shelves. The sound cut the air clean in two. Jake pivoted, heart steady, instincts awake. Footsteps approached, unhurried, confident. The man who stepped into the light filled the doorway without apology. He was tall and thick through the shoulders, wearing a heavy coat open at the chest, the cold seemingly an afterthought. His hair was cropped short and graying at the temples. His beard was trimmed close, a practical line that emphasized a jaw set like stone. His skin was weathered, pale with a hint of red from windburn, eyes pale and flat, the kind that measured outcomes rather than feelings. He moved like someone used to rooms making space for him. Ranger's growl deepened, controlled and resonant, not frantic. "You shouldn't have come," the man said, voice low and even, carrying easily in the cold room. "And you shouldn't have brought the dog." Jake stepped subtly to Ranger's side, not in front of him, not behind, beside. "You're Mason Cole," Jake said, not as a question. Cole's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Names travel farther than people," he replied. He glanced at Ranger, eyes narrowing with something like ownership, like a craftsman assessing a tool he'd set down. "He was never meant for the public," Cole added. "Some things work best in the dark." Ranger shifted his weight, muscles taut, ears pinned, eyes locked on Cole with a focus sharpened by memory. His body trembled once, then steadied. Jake felt it, the moment when fear met resolve and chose to stand. "You don't get to decide that anymore," Jake said. "What you did is coming out." Cole chuckled softly. "You think papers and videos change the truth?" He took a step forward, boots scraping concrete. "The truth is results. The truth is control." Jake didn't raise his voice. "The truth is you broke dogs and blamed them for bleeding." Cole's gaze flicked to the ledger in Jake's hand. For the first time, irritation cracked the calm. "Put that down," he said. Ranger growled, a sound like a held line under tension. Cole stopped, eyes dropping to the dog, then lifting back to Jake. "You don't understand," he said. "You don't bring dogs like him into the light. They remember, they react. People get hurt." Jake's grip tightened on the ledger. People already did. The wind howled outside, rattling boards, flinging snow against the walls. Cole's eyes hardened. "You should walk away," he said quietly. "Right now." Jake didn't move. Ranger held his ground, stance wide, chest forward, not lunging, not retreating. The room felt smaller, the light harsher. Then another sound cut through the standoff, the heavy latch on the outer gate sliding into place. Cole smiled thinly. "Last chance," he said. Jake met his gaze, unflinching. "No," he replied. The door behind them remained shut, the cold pressing in, the past standing tall in front of them, and Ranger's growl filled the space like a vow. Dawn arrived quietly, the kind of winter dawn that felt earned. Snow lay untouched across the training compound, a white expanse softened by the first light of morning, the sky a pale gradient of blue and gold. The abandoned yard no longer felt abandoned, it felt exposed. Jake Carter stood near the open bay door, breath steady, shoulders squared beneath his Navy working uniform, the continuous digital camouflage catching the sunrise in muted pixels. He had not moved when Mason Cole blocked the exit. He had not raised his voice. He had done what years of discipline had taught him to do when the stakes were real, slow everything down until truth had room to breathe. Ranger stood at his side, not pressed behind a leg, not pacing for escape. The German shepherd's posture was balanced and ready, ears forward, tail low but relaxed, amber eyes clear. He was no longer reacting. He was choosing. Jake spoke evenly, words measured. He explained what he had collected, the training footage from the USB, the logs and lists from the storage room, the maintenance records that placed Cole at night sessions never reported, the envelope of corroboration from Daniel Price, and the time-stamped clips from Jake's dash camera showing the black sedan circling his neighborhood and the hollow casing left like punctuation. He spoke without accusation, without flourish, as if laying out coordinates for a rescue rather than a confrontation. Cole scoffed at first, then fell quiet as Jake continued, the calm rhythm of the facts closing in. Ranger did not growl. He did not advance. He stood, breathing slow, the steadiness itself an answer to years of being told he was dangerous. Jake made the call when the sun cleared the ridge. Internal Affairs answered, then Oversight, then patrol units whose names Jake trusted because he had trained with them in community sessions and had seen how they handled silence. The sound of sirens did not rush the moment. They approached like a tide, inevitable. Cole's confidence thinned. He tried once to step past Ranger, a reflex older than sense, and Ranger shifted with him, not lunging, not snapping, just blocking the path with his body, a quiet wall that said enough. Cole stopped. The choice was no longer his. The officers who arrived were led by Captain Elaine Brooks, a woman in her early 50s with iron gray hair cut short and eyes that had learned to weigh rooms quickly. She wore her coat open despite the cold, posture straight, voice precise. She listened to Jake, then to the evidence, then she looked at Ranger, not with fear, not with pity, but with assessment that softened into respect. Cole protested. Brooks didn't argue. She signaled, cuffs clicked, and the sound echoed cleanly in the cold air. Cole was led away without ceremony. The past didn't shout. It surrendered. As the sun climbed, more people arrived. Sarah Lawson among them, tall and lean in a heavy coat, blonde hair pulled back, hazel eyes bright with a relief she had earned. She spoke quietly with Brooks, confirming records she had never been allowed to see before. Aaron Mitchell stood off to the side, hands in his pockets, athletic frame relaxed now that the tension had broken. He met Jake's gaze and nodded once, a simple acknowledgement between people who knew when to step back. Daniel Price did not come, and Jake understood why. Courage sometimes did its work best unseen. By mid-morning, the old compound was sealed, evidence catalogued, statements taken. Jake signed where needed, his hand steady. Ranger stayed close, occasionally sitting, occasionally standing, always present. When a uniformed officer knelt to Ranger's level, careful and respectful, Ranger allowed the touch, then looked back at Jake as if to confirm that this too was safe. Jake nodded. The weeks that followed moved with purpose. Internal reviews widened. People who had learned to keep quiet found their voices. Files reopened. Dates aligned. Cole's methods were named for what they were. Ranger's record was amended line by line, context restored, the word aggression replaced with defensive response under duress. The city did not shout its apology, but it acted. The new training field was bright and open, ringed by trees and low fencing. The snow groomed smooth beneath a winter sun that seemed kinder for having waited. On the morning of Ranger's reinstatement, the air carried that crisp promise again. Jake stood with Brooks, Sarah, and a handful of officers whose faces showed something like pride. Ranger wore a clean working collar, no tags of ownership, only identification earned. When Brooks read the order, her voice steady, the words felt heavy with meaning. Ranger was not being given something new, he was being given back what had been taken. "Officer Ranger," Brooks said, and the title settled into the cold air as if it belonged there. Jake knelt when Ranger trotted forward. The German shepherd ran the field once, fast and true, then returned, slowed, and placed his paw against Jake's knee. The echo of the first touch, on concrete, in fear, was unmistakable. Jake smiled, a real smile, and touched the fabric over his chest as if to acknowledge the oath that had carried him here, then rested his hand on Ranger's head, firm and gentle. It was not a command. It was a promise. The town noticed. Children waved on patrol routes. Shop owners bent to scratch ears. The nickname spread without effort. Warmth carried on ordinary days. Officer Ranger. Jake didn't correct anyone. Some truths didn't need polishing. At dawn 1 week later, Jake and Ranger stood at the edge of the field as light crept across the snow. Ranger leaned in, not from fear, but from choice, and Jake let the quiet hold them both. The work ahead would be long, the world imperfect, but this part was settled. The hero had been called by his name, and he had answered. Sometimes the miracle isn't thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes it's a broken soul being seen at the right moment. This story reminds us that God often works quietly, through patience, through courage, through one person choosing compassion when the world chooses fear. Ranger was never abandoned by God. He was being carried step by step toward the moment someone would listen. In our own lives, we may feel misunderstood, labeled, or forgotten, but no scar is wasted in God's hands. What was meant to break us can become the very place where grace enters. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We read every one. And if you believe in second chances, quiet miracles, and faith stronger than fear, subscribe to this channel. May God bless you, protect you, and walk beside you in every unseen battle. You are not alone, and neither was Ranger.